You wake before dawn, heart thrumming with a thought that arrived like an intruder in the silence of early morning, a whisper that feels heavier than its smallness should allow, the kind of whisper that does not merely cross the mind but settles there with the confidence of something true. What if I fail? The sentence appears without invitation and creates its own gravity, shaping the air, altering the temperature of the room, tightening the breath in your chest. You do not decide to think it, it simply enters, and for a moment the entire world narrows around it. A single thought, a single line of inner narration, and yet everything changes. If you listen closely, if you pay attention to that precise instant when a thought rises and takes hold, you will notice something subtle and astonishing. The thought is not you. It came, certainly, but it did not ask permission. It impressed itself upon you, yes, but it did not originate from the core of who you truly are. Thoughts appear, they insist, they retreat, they contradict themselves, and yet you, the perceiver behind them, remain unchanged by their passing storms. But because human beings mistake thoughts for identity, they bow to them as if they were royal commands. The ancient truth is quieter and more liberating. You are not the thoughts that move through the corridors of your mind, you are the space in which they move. The mind is an active storyteller. It constructs images, strings words together, weaves narratives, and then convinces you that these stories are who you are. It is a master craftsman of illusion. From childhood it learns to categorize the world, to place meaning where there is only raw experience, to create causal chains where events might instead be random currents colliding. A sound in the distance becomes threat. A memory becomes prophecy. A passing emotion becomes a definition of character. The mind learns to speak, and once it does, it refuses silence. It narrates the world like a commentator, interpreting everything through its own biases, its own past wounds, its own habitual fears. And because the narration occurs inside your skull, it sounds like truth. The Stoics understood this centuries before psychology had the language to explain it. They knew that impressions are not reality, they are proposals. They knew that judgment is optional. They taught that the danger lies not in the thought itself, but in the instant of assent, where the mind says, yes, this is who I am, this is how things are. Most people never notice the moment of assent. A thought arrives and becomes identity in the same breath. You think I am powerless, and suddenly you shrink into that shape. You think I am unlovable, and you walk into relationships carrying this as if it were carved into your bones. You think I will fail, and fear becomes your atmosphere, your environment, the lens through which you see yourself. Alan Watts spoke often of the way humans mistake the map for the territory. Thoughts are maps. They are sketches, approximations, guesses, projections. But the mind insists that they are the territory, the land itself, the truth. When you forget the distinction, suffering multiplies. You begin to live inside interpretations instead of life. You become a captive of your own narration. There is a voice inside every person, the quiet or sometimes frantic inner speaker that comments on everything. It judges you. It judges others. It anticipates, regrets, fantasizes, blames, and dramatizes. It speaks with the confidence of something that knows, yet it rarely knows anything at all. It is simply rehearsing old patterns and familiar fears. The tragedy is not that this voice exists. The tragedy is that people believe it is their true self. It is not. It is an actor on the stage of consciousness, playing a role it learned long before you had any choice in the matter. You are the audience, the witness, the awareness behind the voice. The observer is the real home of identity, not the contents that pass through it. When you begin to separate the voice from the listener, the thought from the thinker, the narration from the awareness that perceives it, freedom begins. Identity is often built from stories. You tell yourself who you are the way a novelist tells the arc of a character. You gather memories, successes, failures, traumas, and interpretations. You create a self-image from fragments of experience and then live as if that image were fixed and true. But identity built from thought is brittle, easily threatened, easily shattered. The Stoics urge human beings to see themselves not as fixed entities, but as actors playing temporary roles in a larger drama. The role may be parent, worker, friend, enemy, dreamer, warrior, failure, success, but the role is not the actor. The story is not the essence. When you cling to a story as your identity, change becomes terrifying, growth becomes dangerous, and any thought that contradicts your self-story becomes an existential threat. But when you step back and see the story as a construction, a narrative your mind uses to organize experience, you reclaim the ability to grow beyond it. Thoughts become tyrants when they are fused with identity. Anxiety becomes an identity, I am an anxious person. Shame becomes an identity, I am broken. Anger becomes an identity, I am someone who cannot control themselves. But each of these is merely a thought that has been repeated often enough to feel like truth. The repetition gave it weight. The assent gave it authority. But nothing in the nature of the thought itself makes it true. A thought is a visitor. It stays for a moment and leaves. You, the awareness receiving the visitor, remain. This realization loosens the chains. When the mind throws its worst ideas at you, you can watch them without becoming them. You can observe without collapsing into identification. You can see the storm without believing you are the storm. The connection between thought and body is intimate. Before a thought finishes forming, the body often reacts. Fear tightens the chest, anger heats the skin, shame sinks into the stomach, joy lifts the breath. The physiological reaction then reinforces the thought, and the cycle continues. This dance between mind and body is ancient, carved into the nervous system through evolution. The Stoics, long before neuroscience, understood the importance of stillness in the body to create stillness in the mind. Slow breathing interrupts the panic loop. Grounding sensations interrupt spirals of rumination. When the body steadies, the thought loses momentum. When the thought loses momentum, the panic dissolves. This simple connection is the foundation of freedom. The realization that you are not forced to believe every thought simply because your body reacted to it. The language you use with yourself matters. Words are spells. Sentences become self-fulfilling. When you think I am broken, the mind searches for evidence of brokenness. When you think I cannot change, the body becomes heavy with resignation. But when you think I am experiencing fear rather than I am afraid as an identity, the distance creates possibility. Possibility creates movement. Movement creates change. The Stoics were masters of linguistic precision. They understood that how you label a thought determines how you experience it. Label a thought as truth, and it becomes a cage. Label a thought as a thought, and it becomes air. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that sees them. And the more clearly you remember this, the more freedom you reclaim. It is strange how the mind convinces you that its noise is your identity. You walk through your day carrying thoughts like heavy stones in your pockets, believing they belong to you, believing they represent you, believing they define what kind of human being you are. Yet the more closely you watch these thoughts, the more you begin to notice a curious separation, a gentle gap, a subtle distance between the one who observes and the movements being observed. At first, this gap is so faint that you might miss it entirely. But as you sit long enough with the ever-changing landscape of your inner world, you begin to see that thoughts do not arise with your permission. They do not knock before entering. They do not wait politely for your approval. They appear, they unfold, they transform, and they vanish, often without any logical sequence, without any true origin, and without any final destination. And yet, day after day, you claim ownership over them simply because they happen within the boundaries of your awareness. There is a moment, however, when the illusion begins to fracture. Perhaps it is during a quiet morning when the world hasn't yet demanded your attention and your thoughts flow in softer currents. Or perhaps it happens in the midst of emotional turbulence, when the storm inside you becomes so loud that you have no choice but to step back and witness your own mind burning like a forest fire. Whatever the moment looks like, it is unmistakable once it arrives, because you begin to sense that you are not the one generating every thought. You are not the architect of the inner dialogue. You are merely the witness of a process that happens on its own, a process that has been unfolding long before you were capable of noticing it. This realization brings with it both liberation and fear. Liberation, because for the first time you glimpse the possibility that your thoughts do not hold absolute authority over your life. And fear, because if your thoughts are not entirely yours, then the question arises, what are you exactly? What remains when the noise is stripped away? What stands behind the curtain when the characters in the mental play finish their performance and exit the stage? The mind resists this question violently because it threatens the foundation upon which your identity has been constructed. But if you can sit with the discomfort for just a moment longer, you begin to feel something astonishing. You begin to sense a deeper presence beneath the swirling activity, a quieter form of awareness that is not touched by the content of your thoughts. It observes without reacting. It listens without judgment. It exists without effort. This presence is what the Stoics pointed to when they spoke of distinguishing impressions from assent. An impression appears on its own like a wave rising from the ocean, but assent, the decision to believe, accept, or identify with that impression, is something else entirely. You have no control over the wave, but you have control over whether you let it carry you. The modern mind has forgotten this art. It assumes that every thought must be believed, that every emotion must be acted upon, that every mental image is somehow a reflection of inner truth. But the moment you see the difference between the wave and the ocean, something inside you begins to loosen. You no longer feel compelled to chase every thought into the depths of your mind. You no longer feel enslaved by the narratives that arise without your consent. You begin to reclaim the space between stimulus and response, the space in which freedom quietly resides. The illusions of the mind operate like clever tricksters. One illusion tells you that your negative thoughts define your worth. Another tells you that your anxious thoughts predict the future. Another insists that your self-critical thoughts reveal who you truly are. These illusions survive only because you accept them without questioning their legitimacy. You hand them the keys to your inner world, and they convince you that your identity is inseparable from the temporary fluctuations of your thinking. But if you watch closely, you begin to see how fragile these illusions truly are. A single moment of awareness is enough to reveal that thoughts are merely events, not truths. They are like clouds drifting across the sky of consciousness, momentary shapes that appear and disappear without altering the sky itself. As you deepen your attention, the illusions begin to unravel one by one. You first notice the illusion of permanence. You realize that no matter how convincing a thought feels, it cannot hold its shape for long. It dissolves, it weakens, it fades, often without any effort on your part. Then you notice the illusion of ownership. You see that thoughts arrive out of nowhere, triggered by memories, sensations, external events, or internal patterns that you never intentionally built. Finally, you begin to see the illusion of identity. You watch a thought arise, perhaps a fearful one, perhaps an angry one, perhaps a self-critical one, and in that moment you ask yourself a simple yet transformative question: who is the one observing this thought? The very act of asking the question shifts everything. The thought loses its grip, the emotion loosens its hold, the identity tied to that thought begins to dissolve like a mirage evaporating under sunlight. You start to feel the distinction between consciousness and content, between the witness and the witnessed. And what follows is the quiet birth of inner freedom. As you continue on this path, there comes a moment when you no longer chase your thoughts like a frightened traveler running after shadows. You stop trying to control them, suppress them, or argue with them. Instead, you allow them to pass through your awareness with the same neutrality that you bring to the movement of the wind or the flow of the river. The mind still produces its endless stream of impressions, but you are no longer imprisoned by them. You begin to trust the stillness beneath the surface. You begin to recognize that peace does not come from silencing the mind, but from no longer identifying with it. The more you let go of identification, the more your inner world transforms. Old patterns of worry lose their power. Old habits of catastrophizing become almost amusing in their predictability. Even the mind's darkest illusions appear less threatening, because you see them for what they truly are: momentary expressions of the human condition, not reflections of your essence. What once felt overwhelming now feels manageable. What once felt personal now feels impersonal. What once felt like truth now feels like weather. And so, gradually, you begin to understand at a deeper level what it means to say that you are not your thoughts. You begin to feel the truth of it not as an idea, but as a lived experience. And from that experience grows a steady, grounded form of awareness that cannot be shaken by the storms of the mind. There comes a point in your journey inward when the mind begins to reveal not only its illusions, but the elaborate architecture behind those illusions. At first, you believed that thoughts simply appeared like random visitors knocking on the door of consciousness. But as your awareness sharpens, you begin to notice that the mind doesn't produce thoughts in isolation. It creates them from patterns, old memories, conditioned fears, inherited beliefs, unresolved emotions, and the countless stories you've unconsciously repeated to yourself for years. And when these patterns activate, they shape the way you interpret your experiences, the way you react to your environment, and the way you view yourself. What becomes clear is that the mind's illusions are not accidents. They are the result of deeply ingrained habits. When something triggers you emotionally, your mind instantly reaches into its storehouse of past impressions and pulls out the closest matching thought. When you feel afraid, it calls upon every memory associated with fear. When you feel insecure, it brings forth stories of failure, rejection, or inadequacy. And when you experience something unfamiliar, it rushes to define, categorize, and judge it, often long before you have a chance to fully understand what is happening. This mechanism is neither good nor bad. It simply exists, the product of thousands of years of human evolution. But the danger lies in forgetting that these patterns are not you. They are echoes from the past, remnants of past experiences, fragments of ancient survival strategies that no longer serve the life you are trying to build. Yet the moment you identify with them, the moment you take their voice as your own, you allow the past to shape your present and dictate your future. Awareness becomes the great turning point. When you observe these patterns with clarity, they begin to lose their authority. You start noticing how quickly the mind tries to label everything as good or bad, safe or dangerous, pleasant or unpleasant. You see how it generates commentary even when no commentary is needed. You witness how it resists silence, how it fears stillness, how it clings desperately to the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. And you understand, perhaps for the first time, why inner peace is so rare in a world where everyone lives inside their thoughts rather than beneath them. As you continue observing, something profound begins to unfold. You start to recognize the difference between the mind's automatic reactions and your deeper, wiser awareness. The mind reacts out of habit, but awareness responds out of understanding. The mind speaks loudly, but awareness listens quietly. The mind fears the unknown, but awareness rests comfortably in uncertainty. And as this distinction grows clearer, your relationship with your inner world begins to transform. You start noticing moments when thoughts arise, but you no longer rush to follow them. A fearful thought appears, but instead of spiraling into worry, you pause and watch. An angry thought forms, but instead of being consumed by it, you observe the tension in your chest, the heat in your face, the tightening in your muscles. and slowly you begin to see that thoughts are not the cause of suffering. Identification with thoughts is the cause. The Stoics understood this well. They taught that the world does not disturb us. Our judgments about the world disturb us. A thought is simply an impression, a momentary flash of interpretation. But whether that interpretation becomes suffering is entirely up to you. If you assent to it, if you merge with it, if you allow it to dictate your emotional state, you become captive to the mind's illusions. But if you step back and allow the thought to pass like a gust of wind through an open doorway, it loses its power. It has no choice but to dissolve. What becomes interesting is how the mind responds when you stop feeding it with blind identification. At first it becomes louder, more chaotic. It tries harder to pull you into its stories. Old fears arise with new intensity. Old criticisms echo more sharply. Old narratives try to reattach themselves to your identity. The mind panics when you stop obeying it because your newfound awareness feels like a threat to the patterns it has operated through for years. But if you remain steady, something shifts. The mind slowly begins to soften. It realizes it no longer has to protect you from imaginary dangers or overwhelm you with rehearsed catastrophes. It no longer needs to fill every silent space with commentary. It begins to trust the awareness that oversees it, the deeper intelligence that guides your life with a calmness the mind could never produce. And in this shift, a new layer of understanding emerges. You begin to see that the mind is not your enemy. It is not something to fight against or suppress. It is simply a tool, a powerful tool. But a tool nonetheless, a tool designed to imagine, to calculate, to plan, to analyze, to protect. But like any tool, it becomes harmful when it is used improperly, when it is mistaken for the master rather than the servant. The moment you reclaim the role of the observer, the mind willingly resumes its proper place, becoming an ally rather than a tyrant. As this transformation deepens, your inner experience begins to change in subtle yet profound ways. Emotional turbulence becomes less frequent. Fear loses some of its sharpness. Stress feels less suffocating. Even your relationships shift because you no longer interpret others' actions through the lens of your old thought patterns. You listen more openly. You speak more intentionally. You respond rather than react. Most importantly, you begin to experience moments of spaciousness within yourself, moments where the mind becomes quiet, not because you forced it into silence, but because you stopped clinging to its noise. These moments feel like glimpses of your true nature, like windows opening into the deeper reality of who you are, a reality that is beyond thought, beyond memory, beyond the shifting narratives of the mind. And it is in these moments that you realize something extraordinary. Peace was never something you had to chase. It was always there, waiting beneath the layers of thought, waiting beneath the illusions, waiting beneath the storms. All you needed was the courage to step back, to observe, to disentangle yourself from the movements of the mind, and to rest in the awareness that has been watching all along.